Early in the morning, before the sun had fully settled over the street, a violent pounding shook my front door hard enough to rattle the frame. It wasn't the kind of knock you ignore or mistake for a delivery. It was sharp, deliberate, official. My heart kicked up as I walked over and pulled the door open. And that's when I saw them. 2 HOA compliance officers stood rigid on my porch, flanking a woman in a navy blazer who held a clipboard against her chest like it was a badge of authority. She didn't greet me, didn't even ask my name. She just looked me dead in the eye and said, "You've been notified multiple times. This is your final notice before seizure proceedings continue." The word hit me like a brick. Seizure. For a second, I genuinely thought she had the wrong house. I told her this had to be about some minor mistake, that the only thing I'd ever received was a $40 trash bin fine. Her expression didn't change. "It's now $2,843.17, she said flatly, with penalties. And growing. Then she handed me a thick envelope stamped with legal markings. I opened it right there, my fingers suddenly unsteady, and saw the words that didn't make sense no matter how many times I read them. Foreclosure initiated. My house, over something I barely even understood. I glanced around and noticed movement in the windows across the street, neighbors watching quietly, but not one person stepping outside, not one voice saying a word. And in that silence, something clicked into place. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't a mistake. This was deliberate. And whatever I had just stepped into, it was a lot bigger than $40. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline File Stories. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? When I first moved into the neighborhood, it felt like I had finally found the kind of place people talk about but rarely experience. Quiet streets, trimmed lawns, clean sidewalks, and that calm, almost picture-perfect order that makes you think everything is under control. The HOA was part of that image. At the time, I saw it as a good thing. Rules meant consistency, and consistency meant stability. I paid my dues on time every single month, kept my yard clean, followed every guideline they handed out without question. For years, there wasn't a single issue with my name on it. No warnings, no complaints, nothing. I blended in like everyone else, and that's exactly how I wanted it. The first time I noticed something felt off, it was subtle. The HOA president, a woman named Diane Mercer, had a presence that didn't match the friendly tone of the community newsletters. She was always composed, always controlled, but there was something in the way she spoke to people, sharp, measured, like every word was chosen to remind you she had authority. At meetings, she didn't discuss rules, she enforced them. No room for interpretation, no space for conversation. At first, I thought she was just strict, maybe even efficient. But over time, I started seeing patterns that didn't sit right. Some houses seemed to get inspected more than others. Certain neighbors would suddenly receive violations over things no one had ever cared about before. I overheard quiet conversations, people lowering their voices when the HOA came up, exchanging looks instead of opinions. No one openly complained, but no one defended the system either. It was like everyone understood something, but no one wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Then came my turn. The notice was taped to my door one afternoon like it had been placed there on purpose, right at eye level. A $40 violation for leaving my trash bin out 30 minutes past the allowed time. I actually laughed when I read it. 30 minutes. It felt so small, so ridiculous, that I didn't even take it seriously. I told myself it wasn't worth the effort to argue, that it would probably disappear if I ignored it. So I did. A week later, another letter showed up. The amount had increased. There was no explanation, just a new total and a reminder to pay immediately. That was the first moment I paused, but even then, I brushed it off. I figured it was some automated system, maybe a clerical issue. Then the email started. Short, formal, increasingly firm. Each one carried a slightly sharper tone than the last, like whoever was writing them was losing patience with me personally. After that came the certified mail, stamped and official, impossible to ignore. That's when the feeling really settled in. The tone had changed. This wasn't a minor rule being enforced anymore. It felt like something was building, like the system had shifted its attention directly onto me. I tried reaching out, asking for clarification, just a simple breakdown of the charges and where they were coming from. Every response I got felt like it had been written to avoid answering anything at all. Vague references to policy, compliance, and standard procedure, but nothing specific. No numbers I could trace, no rule I could match to the growing amount they claimed I owed. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one night, reading through the latest document they sent, trying to make sense of it line by line. The numbers didn't add up. The fees didn't connect to any actual violations I could find in the bylaws I had signed when I moved in. It was like they were building something out of thin air and expecting me to accept it without question. That was the moment the thought hit me clearly for the first time. Something is off here. And then, just when I was starting to question everything, another statement arrived. Longer, more detailed, filled with charges that didn't match any real rule I could find. Numbers stacked on top of each other like they had been created for one purpose only, to overwhelm me. I decided the only way to stop things from spiraling further was to face it directly, so I showed up at the HOA office in person, documents in hand, determined to resolve everything calmly and logically. The building itself was as polished as the neighborhood. Clean glass doors, quiet hallways, everything designed to feel official and controlled. When I walked into the meeting room, Diane Mercer was already there, seated at the head of the table with that same composed posture, her clipboard resting neatly in front of her. A few other board members sat nearby, silent, watching. I introduced myself and explained the situation as clearly as I could, keeping my tone respectful, even patient. I told them I didn't understand the charges, that I wanted a simple breakdown, something I could verify against the rules I had agreed to. Diane didn't interrupt me once. She just waited until I finished, then leaned back slightly and folded her hands, as if the outcome had already been decided before I walked in. When she spoke, her voice was calm but distant, stripped of anything resembling cooperation. She didn't answer my questions. Instead, she repeated phrases that sounded more like legal disclaimers than explanations. Non-compliance penalties, administrative escalation, failure to resolve within designated time frame. It was language designed to sound precise, but it said nothing. Every time I tried to steer the conversation back to specifics, what rule, what fee, what timeline, she redirected it, keeping everything just vague enough to avoid being pinned down. That's when I started noticing it more clearly. They weren't just avoiding answers, they were controlling the conversation. Any attempt I made to get clarity was met with either silence or a rehearsed response that pushed the responsibility back onto me. It wasn't about helping me understand. It was about making sure I felt out of place for even asking. One of the board members even slid a document toward me without a word, as if that alone should end the discussion. When I looked at it, it was just another summary of charges, the same numbers, the same lack of explanation. I tried one last time to keep things reasonable. I told them I was willing to pay the original fine, even some of the additional fees if necessary, just to resolve the situation and move on. It felt like a fair compromise. But Diane didn't even consider it. She shook her head slightly and said, "Partial payments do not satisfy compliance requirements. No room for negotiation, no acknowledgement of effort, just a flat rejection." As I left the office, frustration building in a way I hadn't felt before, someone caught up to me in the parking lot. It was one of the neighbors I had seen around but never really spoken to, a middle-aged man who kept his voice low, glancing back toward the building like he didn't want to be seen talking to me. "Listen," he said quietly, "you need to be careful." I asked him what he meant, and he hesitated for a second before saying something that stuck with me. "Don't fight them. It only gets worse." There was no drama in his tone, no exaggeration, just a quiet certainty, like he'd seen it happen before. I stood there for a moment after he walked away, replaying everything in my head. The meeting, the way they spoke, the way they avoided every direct question. And that's when the realization settled in fully. This wasn't about a trash bin. This wasn't about following rules. This was about pressure. Controlled, deliberate pressure designed to push me into submission. And just as that thought locked into place, things escalated again. When I got home, I found another envelope waiting for me, thicker than anything they had sent before. Inside was a stack of violation notices, all dated within days of each other, each one adding new charges, new penalties, new reasons that didn't make sense. It wasn't just one issue anymore. It was a flood, a coordinated wave meant to bury me under paperwork and numbers I couldn't keep up with. After that stack of notices showed up, everything shifted from pressure to something that felt a lot more like targeted harassment. It wasn't occasional anymore. It was constant. Every day brought something new. Fresh notices taped to my door before I even finished my morning coffee. Bright warning stickers slapped onto my trash bin or mailbox like I was some kind of repeat offender. Emails landing in my inbox with language that kept getting sharper, colder, more aggressive. At first, they had sounded formal. Now they sounded personal. Every message carried the same underlying tone: comply immediately or face consequences. And the consequences kept getting bigger. Then the inspection started. At least, that's what they called them. I'd come home and notice things slightly out of place. My side gate left open when I knew I'd locked it. Footprints cutting across parts of my yard no one had any reason to walk through. One afternoon, I caught it happening in real time. I pulled into my driveway and saw a man in a reflective vest standing near the side of my house, clipboard in hand, taking pictures like he had every right to be there. When I asked him what he was doing on my property, he didn't apologize or even step back. He just said, "Routine HOA inspection," like that explained everything. No notice. No permission. Just authority assumed. That was the moment I called the police. I explained everything: trespassing, harassment, escalating fines that didn't make sense. When the officer arrived, he listened, nodded, and then gave me the same answer I wasn't prepared for. "It's a civil matter." He said it like it was standard, like he'd said it 100 times before. There was nothing he could do unless it turned criminal. And somehow, everything that was happening to me didn't qualify. After that, the tone from the HOA changed again. The emails stopped pretending to be polite. The letters started referencing legal action directly. Phrases like, "Failure to comply will result in enforcement escalation, and further remedies will be pursued without additional notice." It felt like they were building a case, stacking paperwork in a way that made it look like I had ignored them at every step, even though I had tried to engage from the beginning. The pressure didn't stay on paper either. It followed me into everything. I couldn't relax in my own home without wondering what would show up next. I stopped sleeping properly, waking up at every noise outside, half expecting someone to be back on my property again. Meals turned into quick distractions instead of actual breaks. My phone became something I dreaded looking at, knowing another message would be waiting. It wasn't just frustration anymore. It was stress that sat in my chest and didn't go away. What made it worse was the silence. Neighbors who used to wave stopped making eye contact. A couple of them would quickly turn away if they saw me outside. Others stayed behind closed curtains, watching but never stepping in. It wasn't just that they didn't want to help. It felt like they already knew what was happening and had chosen to stay out of it. That quiet, collective distance said more than any conversation could have. And the more I thought about it, the more a pattern started forming in my head. This wasn't new to them. The way everything was structured, the speed of escalation, the lack of explanation, the coordinated pressure, it felt practiced. Like they had done this before. Like I wasn't the first person to get pulled into this system, just the latest one. That realization settled in hard. Because if they had done it before, then they knew exactly how far they could push. And just when I thought things couldn't escalate any further, they did. One morning, mixed in with the usual stack of notices, I found something different. Thicker. Heavier. Official in a way the others hadn't been. I opened it slowly, already feeling that same cold weight settle in my chest, and there it was. Formal documentation stating that foreclosure proceedings had been initiated against my property. When I saw the foreclosure notice in my hands, the first thing that hit me wasn't anger. It was pure cold shock. The kind that makes everything around you go quiet for a second, like your brain is trying to catch up to something it refuses to accept. Then came the fear. Real, heavy fear that settled deep in my chest as the reality started to sink in. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This wasn't pressure or intimidation. They were actually moving to take my home. For a brief moment, I felt completely overwhelmed, like I was already losing and didn't even understand how I got there. But somewhere in that spiral, something shifted. The fear didn't disappear, but it sharpened. It forced me to stop reacting the way they expected me to. That was the moment I stopped playing defense. Instead of replying to their emails or trying to argue with them directly, I stepped back and started looking at everything from the outside. If they were using a system against me, then I needed to understand that system better than they did. I pulled out every document I had, every notice, every letter, every email, and laid them out in front of me. Then I went deeper. I started reading the HOA bylaws line by line, not skimming, not assuming, but actually studying them. Enforcement clauses, penalty structures, escalation procedures, everything they had ever written down about how they were supposed to operate. At first, it was overwhelming. The language was dense, full of legal phrasing designed to confuse more than clarify. But the more I read, the more patterns started to emerge. And then I noticed something that didn't sit right. The way my fines had grown didn't match the structure outlined in their own rules. There were steps missing, required notices that never happened, timelines that didn't align, penalties that seemed to jump without explanation. I cross-checked everything against the documents they had sent me, and the inconsistencies became impossible to ignore. Then I looked at the foreclosure process itself. That's where things really started to crack. According to their own filings, their authority to initiate foreclosure wasn't automatic. It depended on specific conditions being met. Conditions tied to proper enforcement procedures, documented compliance attempts, and clearly defined violations. But in my case, those conditions were either incomplete or missing entirely. The more I dug, the clearer it became. This system wasn't clean. It was structured in a way that looked legitimate on the surface, but underneath, it relied on people not questioning it too closely. On people giving in before they had a chance to understand it. That realization changed everything. I knew I couldn't handle this alone anymore, so I made the decision to bring in someone who could see it from a legal perspective. Hiring a lawyer wasn't cheap, and I knew from the start this wasn't going to be a small expense. But at that point, it wasn't about saving money. It was about saving my home. As we went through everything together, line by line, something even bigger surfaced. Buried deep in their own bylaws was a clause that tied their enforcement authority to a specific requirement, one they had completely violated in my case. It wasn't obvious. It wasn't something you'd notice unless you were looking for it. But once we found it, it changed the entire situation. If that condition wasn't met, their ability to enforce penalties at that level, and especially to initiate foreclosure, collapsed. But it came with a risk. A serious one. If we were wrong, if we misinterpreted even a small part of it, I wouldn't just lose the argument, I'd lose everything. My house, my stability. Everything I had built there. And pursuing it meant committing fully, both legally and financially. By the time we outlined the strategy, the cost was already climbing toward $10,000. I sat with that decision longer than I expected. Because this wasn't just about fighting back anymore. It was about choosing to step into something that could either save me or completely destroy me. And in the end, I made the only choice I could live with. I decided to go all in. Once I made the decision to fight back, everything I did became deliberate. I stopped reacting and started documenting. Every notice they had ever sent me, I organized in order. Every email, every timestamp, every small detail that I had ignored before suddenly mattered. I built a timeline from the very first $40 fine all the way to the foreclosure notice, lining up their actions against their own rules. The more I laid it out, the clearer the pattern became. This wasn't random enforcement. It wasn't even strict enforcement. It was selective. The penalties didn't follow a consistent structure, and the escalation didn't match their own procedures. Fees appeared out of nowhere, inflated beyond anything outlined in the bylaws, and always in a way that pushed the total higher, faster, more aggressively than it should have. That pattern was the first real confirmation that what I had suspected wasn't just in my head. But I needed more. So I started talking to people, carefully, quietly, without drawing attention. Not everyone was willing to engage, but a few were. Conversations happened in short exchanges, in lowered voices, often with people glancing over their shoulders like they didn't want to be seen speaking to me. And what I heard started to match what I was experiencing. Small violations turning into large penalties. Confusing notices. Pressure that escalated quickly once it started. Some had paid just to make it stop. Others had come close to serious consequences before backing down. No one had pushed it as far as I had. Until now. Then one conversation changed everything. It was an older neighbor, someone who had lived there long before I moved in. He didn't say much at first, but when I told him what was happening to me, something in his expression shifted. After a long pause, he went inside and came back with a folder, thin, worn, but carefully kept. Inside were copies of notices he had received years ago, along with correspondence that showed something very specific. His fees had been escalated in a way that didn't follow the bylaws either. But more importantly, there was a response, an internal HOA communication that referenced adjusting penalties outside standard procedure. That was it. That was the proof I needed. This wasn't just mismanagement. It was a pattern of behavior, a system that operated one way on paper and another in practice. With that, everything came together. I worked with my lawyer to build the case piece by piece, aligning my timeline with the evidence we now had. The loophole we had found wasn't just theoretical anymore. It was supported by real examples, real documentation, real inconsistencies that couldn't be explained away. We prepared everything carefully, knowing that if we presented it right, it wouldn't just stop the foreclosure. It would expose the entire structure they were relying on. Meanwhile, the HOA kept moving forward like nothing had changed. Their notices became even more urgent, referencing deadlines, final opportunities, consequences that sounded immediate and unavoidable. They scheduled what they described as the final action, one last step before enforcement would be carried out. From their perspective, I was exactly where they wanted me. Silent, not responding, not paying. To them, it probably looked like I was breaking under the pressure, like I had given up or run out of options. But that couldn't have been further from the truth, because while they were pushing forward with their process, I was building something they weren't prepared for. Every document, every inconsistency, every violation of their own rules was now part of a strategy designed to hit them all at once, at the exact moment they thought they had already won. And then the date was set. A formal hearing. Final review. The point where they expected to move forward without resistance. Only this time, I was ready. The day of the hearing arrived with a kind of stillness that didn't match what I was feeling inside. The HOA meeting room was already full by the time I walked in, the same polished space I had sat in before, but this time it felt heavier, more formal, like everything that had been building was about to settle into a single moment. The entire board was present, seated in a row with their documents neatly arranged, and Diane Mercer sat at the center, composed as ever, her expression calm in a way that suggested complete control. Around the room, neighbors had gathered, some standing along the walls, others seated quietly, watching. I recognized a few faces, but most of them avoided eye contact when I looked their way, as if even being seen acknowledging me might pull them into something they didn't want to be part of. From the moment the meeting began, it was clear how they saw this playing out. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in their tone. Diane led the discussion like it was a formality, something that had already been decided behind closed doors. They presented their case in a structured, rehearsed narrative, outlining my failure to comply with HOA regulations, listing violations one after another, stacking them in a way that made it sound overwhelming and definitive. The numbers were repeated, the deadlines emphasized, the language sharpened just enough to paint me as someone who had ignored every opportunity to resolve the issue. It was clean, controlled, and completely one-sided. I sat there and listened. I didn't interrupt, didn't react, didn't give them anything to push against. On the outside, I stayed calm, steady, almost detached. But inside, the weight of what was happening pressed hard against me, because I knew exactly what was at stake. If this didn't go the way we planned, if even one piece of our argument failed to land the way it needed to, I wouldn't just walk out of that room disappointed. I would walk out without a home. Everything I had worked for, everything tied to that place, would be gone. That thought sat in the back of my mind the entire time, sharp and constant, but I didn't let it show. At one point, I glanced over at my lawyer. He didn't say anything, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was enough. A signal that everything we had prepared was ready, that we had reached the moment we had been building toward. That quiet confirmation steadied me more than anything else in the room. Meanwhile, Diane continued, her tone growing more assertive as she moved toward the conclusion. She emphasized the HOA's authority, the consistency of their enforcement, the necessity of action in cases like mine. She spoke like someone who had done this many times before, someone who expected no resistance at this stage. To her, this wasn't a confrontation. It was the final step in a process that had already run its course. And the rest of the board followed her lead, nodding along, occasionally adding brief comments that reinforced the same narrative. Then she paused. There was a brief moment of silence as she looked down at her notes, then back up at the room. Given the continued failure to resolve these violations, she said, her voice measured and firm, we will now proceed with final determination. That was it. The moment they had been working toward. The moment they believed they controlled. I felt the tension tighten in my chest, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of everything about to unfold. Every document, every hour spent digging through their system, every risk I had taken to get to this point, it all came down to what happened next. They moved to formalize the decision, voices steady, confident, already treating the outcome as inevitable. And just as they began to lock it in, I stood up. When I stood up, the room shifted in a way that was almost physical, like the air itself tightened for a second. Diane's voice cut off mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward me. I didn't raise my voice, didn't rush, didn't show the pressure I'd been carrying. I just placed my documents on the table in front of me and said, as evenly as I could, that I had something the board needed to see before they made any final decision. There was hesitation at first, a brief exchange of looks between the members, but my lawyer stepped forward just enough to anchor the moment, and that was all it took. I began with the timeline. Every notice they had sent, every date, every increase in fees laid out in order, aligned against their own bylaws. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I just showed them. Line by line, I pointed out where their process had skipped required steps, where penalties had been added without proper documentation, where escalation had jumped beyond what their own rules allowed. At first, they tried to maintain composure, but I could see it starting to break in small ways, papers being flipped more quickly, glances exchanged that weren't as confident as before. Then I moved to the pattern. I introduced the additional documentation, the evidence from another resident showing the same type of fee escalation, the same inconsistencies, the same deviation from procedure. It wasn't just my case anymore. It was a pattern, a method. Something that had been done more than once, quietly, without scrutiny. The room grew quieter as that realization settled in, the weight of it spreading beyond just the board and into the audience watching from the sides. But the real shift came when we revealed the clause. I referenced their own governing document, the one they relied on to justify their authority, and pointed directly to the condition tied to enforcement escalation, the requirement they were obligated to meet before taking action at this level. Then I showed how they had failed to meet it, not partially, completely. The steps weren't followed, the requirements weren't satisfied, and without that, their authority to initiate foreclosure didn't exist the way they claimed it did. I let that sit for a moment, because it needed to. Because everything they had built their case on depended on that authority being valid. And it wasn't. The silence that followed was different from anything that had come before. It wasn't tense, it was stunned. The kind of silence where no one moves because they're still processing what just happened. Diane tried to respond, but for the first time since I had known her, there was a crack in her composure. Her words weren't as precise, her tone not as controlled. She attempted to redirect, to frame it as a misunderstanding, but it didn't land the way it had before. Because now the board was looking at her differently. They weren't just listening anymore. They were questioning. One of the members leaned forward, flipping through the documents more carefully now, asking about the missing steps. Another pointed out the discrepancy in the fee escalation. What had been a unified front only minutes earlier began to fracture right there in front of everyone. The confidence that had filled the room at the start of the meeting was gone, replaced by uncertainty and quiet tension. That's when legal authority stepped in. It wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no sudden interruption. Just a calm, firm acknowledgement that the issues presented needed to be addressed before any further action could be taken. That alone was enough to shift control completely. The process they had been so certain of was no longer theirs to direct. Diane tried one last time to regain footing, to reassert control over the narrative, but it was too late. The foundation had already been exposed. The authority she relied on had been stripped down to something fragile, something that couldn't hold under scrutiny. Within minutes, the direction of the meeting changed. The foreclosure action was halted. An investigation into their enforcement practices was initiated. Their authority, at least in the way they had been using it, was effectively removed from that moment forward. I stood there, not saying anything else, not needing to. Because everything that had been building, everything they had tried to use against me, had just flipped completely. The same system that had been used to pressure me, isolate me, and push me toward losing everything, collapsed right there in front of everyone. In the weeks that followed, the change in the neighborhood was impossible to ignore. What had once felt silent and controlled started to loosen, like something that had been held too tight for too long was finally allowed to breathe again. The HOA board didn't survive what happened in that room. Diane Mercer was removed from her position along with several others, and the authority they had exercised so confidently was suddenly under review. Investigations began quietly at first, then more openly, pulling apart their records, their enforcement history, and the way they had handled cases like mine. What we had uncovered wasn't isolated, and the deeper it went, the clearer it became that the system they built wasn't just flawed, it had been used in ways it never should have been. Legal consequences followed, not instantly, but steadily, like a process that had finally been set in motion after being ignored for too long. The silence in the neighborhood didn't last either. People who had avoided me before started acknowledging me again, first with small gestures, then with actual conversations. A few neighbors came up to me directly, apologizing in ways that felt genuine, even if a little late. They admitted they had seen things before, suspected something wasn't right, but never wanted to be the one to stand against it. I didn't hold it against them. I understood what that kind of pressure could do. I had felt it myself. The difference was, at some point, I had decided not to back down. Over time, the atmosphere shifted completely. The HOA was restructured, new leadership brought in with a different tone, less control, more transparency. Rules were still there, but they were applied the way they were supposed to be, not used as tools to push people into corners. For the first time since all of this started, the neighborhood actually felt like the place I thought I had moved into in the beginning, and my life, slowly, it returned to normal. The constant tension disappeared. The emails stopped. The fear that had been sitting in the back of my mind every day faded into something distant, something I didn't have to carry anymore. I could walk through my own home without thinking about what might come next. I could sit in silence without it feeling heavy, but I never forgot what it took to get there. Because, in the end, this was never really about a $40 fine. That was just the starting point. What it was really about was control, how easily it can grow when no one questions it, how quickly it can turn into something bigger when it goes unchecked. I had come closer than I ever expected to losing everything over something that should have been insignificant. And the only reason it stopped was because I chose to face it instead of avoiding it. There's a moment I think about sometimes, standing in that room, realizing everything was about to turn. It wasn't relief I felt first, it was clarity. The understanding that the system only worked because people believed they couldn't fight it. I almost lost everything. But standing up changed everything. And if there's one thing I took from all of this, it's simple. Power only works when no one challenges it. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to Fenceline Files. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?